just let's start with climate change and the impacts of climate change. Your work in the Arctic, what sort of impacts are you already seeing in the Arctic of climate change, and what sort of ripple effects are you seeing from that impact through the rest of the world?
Well, I think that it's very clear that the Arctic scientific community have very strong both observational and satellite data that are showing the changes that are happening in the Arctic. Is warming four times faster, and we've got crises happening on the ice sheet in Greenland, and also on the land with permafrost. So the Arctic is in crisis and is in itself a climate vulnerable region. But the changes that is happening to the Arctic are driving risks throughout the rest of the world and really ramping up those impacts, like the Pakistan floods that you mentioned, the Nigerian floods that are happening right now, and beyond. So what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. It goes to the rest of the world and is really creating a lot of impacts for people and economies.
And when we talk about climate justice, can you tell us just a little bit about from your work and your sustainability work, which poorer countries, shall we say, do you see as being most at risk from climate change?
Yeah, great. So I'm a social scientist. So what I do is I take the natural science data on Arctic change and climate change more generally, and I bring it into those discussions of risk. And climate justice and injustice is really one of the most important discussions. We can see countries like the Philippines, which have a fraction of 1% of global emissions today, but are incredibly vulnerable to the impacts. We see the same with Pakistan, Nigeria, large parts of the African continent, the Caribbean, low-lying states, so the island states throughout the world and beyond. And the Arctic itself, communities that live there have had only a tiny impact on global emissions, but are clearly suffering now.
And so before we get on to talking about COP and what we expect from COP, how would you describe the progress made to date on this climate justice issue? I mean, obviously, as I said at the beginning, climate, when you boil down to it, all of it is about climate justice, but this sort of very specific issue about getting money to the poorer countries who can't afford adaptation. How would you describe the progress that's been made over the last 5 to 10 years on that score?
No progress is how I would say in a nutshell. I mean, it boggles the mind that we can see these impacts happening. We know from a scientific perspective they are being caused and accelerated by climate change, and the rich countries around the world are ignoring that, despite whatever commitments they may make at previous COPs. They're just not transferring those finances to those that are suffering.
And the international community talks about $100 billion a year, which we're still waiting for. That's money transferred from the global north to the global south. How long do you think it's going to be before that becomes a regular payment? And B, is that enough? And if not, how much more money needs to be? Can we quantify the amount of money that we're actually talking about here?
Well, I don't think we can quantify all of the money that's needed, but certainly the economic integrated assessment models that we've done on even things of losing our Arctic sea ice and permafrost thaw, which would be huge tipping points, but we're well on track to trigger those. We're talking trillions of US dollars impact over time. The issue with climate justice, of course, is not just the loss and damage right now or in the next 20 years. It's over the next 100 years, 200 years. Those communities will either still be suffering or they will have migrated, which is going to cause conflict globally. In terms of when is the 100 billion going to happen? Well, I would say it's got to start happening in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. Do I believe that's going to happen? The jury's out from my mind. I just cannot believe that we keep delaying it. On the one good side, I do see coming from Glasgow COP26 a loss and damage back on the agenda in a significant way. And that's thanks to a lot of different actors and the Climate Vulnerable Forum, certainly, which is a very, I think, inspirational group of 55 climate vulnerable countries around the world, has been massively pushing that. Certainly Bangladesh was the chair last year. And I think, Bangladesh, Ghana, and others are pushing very strong in Egypt as well.
And just to clarify for the non-sort of climate experts here, loss and damage is essentially it's a climate reparations, right? So again, like Pakistan, we talked about, Pakistan would argue, historically speaking, we've only contributed a tiny fraction of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we are paying an unfair part of the impact of climate change, even though we didn't cause it. So we need reparations.
John, and if I could give you an example, the Pakistan floods alone, not only was it a humanitarian disaster, but estimates are that the economic impact was somewhere around $30 billion US. So that's just one event. They're not small potatoes here. And for countries that are already struggling with poverty alleviation, food and water security, adding in these kind of costs is crippling.
And do you think the moral charge of the imagery from Pakistan was incredible? For those of you who haven't seen it, I mean, it's some of the most striking video I've seen in recent years of the climate crisis. Do you feel that the moral charge of that event, of that tragedy, will move the needle a little bit as we get closer to COP and get down to these loss and damage negotiations?
I think it helps. I think the fact that we've now got Nigeria, we also had, Hurricane Ian hit in the state of Florida, which, although the U.S. is not a climate vulnerable, undeveloped country, it certainly has massive parts of it that are poor, marginalized people that are picking up the costs within those kinds of countries. I'm not sure it's enough. I think the thing that scared me the most in Reykjavik last week was the data that I saw from the Indian delegation, where they were looking at how the Arctic, for example, was going to be threatening the Asian monsoon. And if we start to see massive changes in the monsoon, we are talking affecting billions of people in terms of fundamental food and water security. And that kind of humanitarian disaster, I don't actually know how those regions in the world would recover from that. So the question is, can people see these terrible things that are happening now as just a small example of what can happen relatively quickly? And I just don't know yet. Egypt itself, in terms of a climate vulnerable country, is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise, and in fact is itself a victim of climate injustice. So let's hope their negotiating team pushes those buttons. But I just simply don't know. I think when we look at the elephant in the room in Europe, it is the war and the threats to energy security, and where we actually see even European countries that have been strong proponents of cutting emissions, going back to whether that's coal, or we see the rise of the discussion on fracking in the UK, that's going in the wrong direction because of short-term crises, which I understand. But all I can say is that the physics is not going to change. And if we're going to actually bend the emissions curve in half by 2030, we cannot delay it. So, the pressure is on.
The climate story, there's a lot to be bleak about, there's a lot to be concerned about. But in terms of like signs of hope, signs of optimism, if you could sort of list three things where you think we are going in the right direction and do offer a glimmer of hope that we might get out of this crisis, what would you cite?
Well, I would say certainly the unusual collaborations across different kinds of stakeholder groups. In particular, I find hope coming from the work that's happening with non-state actors like the mayors big, large urban cities around the world, and also some of the large multinationals. The trick is, can they work together to really deal with the hotspots around the world and build resilience and adaptive capacity and hopefully significant mitigation so that we can avoid the worst of the climate emergency. So, when we were in Glasgow, the fact that there were so many corporate leaders at the CEO level, there was a lot of investors that were pledging major dollars, major pounds of investment in the low carbon economy. That was different than previous COPs. And I think that is a sign of hope. The trigger will be, is do they actually act? And do they really act in a science-backed way. I think that's the key thing. We cannot just simply say we're going to act and then invest in non-sustainable alternatives. And an example is the COVID economic recovery funds that were once in a lifetime scale across the world of investment. A very few percentage points, maybe 21%, was actually fueling the green economy. That's a missed opportunity, but we can start to realign those investments now. When we look in Europe and we look at the rightful need to build Ukraine back, hopefully when a peace is attained, hopefully sooner rather than later. When we brought the top climate scientists from Ukraine to Davos in May this year, her call was strongly, if you're building Ukraine back, build it back as a beacon of low carbon hope. So build it back in a low carbon way. So those voices and the fact that they're getting out there, I think is important. It's really going to be, how do we act and how do we encourage that kind of unusual collaboration?
Is that all? I mean, again, this is a discussion in a panel about climate justice and climate adaptation in poorer parts of the world. Do you see that sort of unusual, different kind of collaboration? Is that happening in the developing world as well?
Yeah, for example, I did a presentation on climate risk and strategic leadership to a extremely large Philippines-based headquartered company a few weeks ago. I talked to company heads all around the world, and what I show them is their risks in their own country, and you simply cannot have a good economy when your communities are going to be suffering. So I see how they're linking in with their colleagues and leaders, business leaders in the developed world, and putting pressure on them, quite frankly. And I think that is the way to go. I think the missing point, John, and how I'm ending all of my conversations with business, with science, with government, is the need for courage. We need courageous leadership. We need to dig deep and actually make those, I think, difficult decisions and do what we think is impossible. There's no way out of this. We cannot delay it. And I said that recently to the CEO of one of Europe's largest renewable companies, who at the same time was saying that, hey, we've got to get energy security in Europe. There's, it's coming in winter. People are suffering because of the war and the changes in the energy system dynamics. And I said, fair enough, but I think that the only question I have is, where are you going to make the cuts later on? You and the larger energy system, because we don't have more time. The clock is very close to midnight.
That is very, very true. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but before we close, I think it'd be great if you could just give this audience maybe just a little primer on getting back to the loss and damage question. We are going into COP in a few weeks' time. It's going to be running for 2 weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh. Loss and damage is going to be a big part of it. Certainly the developing world really wants to get it under the agenda. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the fault lines, the dividing lines, and what this audience should be looking out for and what progress might look like?
Well, I think that there's a few things. I mean, I think that climate injustice is spanning the gamut of different kinds of countries. So certainly, the Chinese arguments for climate injustice are out there. It has not been historically driven by Chinese emissions, but China, of course, is a huge economic powerhouse and is a big emitter country, as is India. So there are definitely fault lines within that. Both of those major emitting countries that are economic powerhouses are arguing certain ways. Then we've got the poorer developed countries that are really suffering from loss and damage and are not economic powerhouses. And that's where they have coalitions of, say, the Climate Vulnerable Forum. Everybody wants more justice, but some are arguing that gives them the right to emit more and longer, and others are saying, look, we need help in both the transition and in actually paying for the damages that we've got. At the same time, we can see how in the developed world where they commit happily or perhaps unhappily, but certainly they commit to giving $100 billion investment in the low carbon economy transition in the developing world, but they don't actually deliver on it. So talk is cheap. It's really about how are we going to move forward. I think there will be also there'll be debates about what is loss and damage. How do we know an event is related to climate change? Is it the full event? Is it part of the event? I mean, we've always had floods, we've always had hurricanes, we've always had typhoons, etc. I think the real question is how much of that is ramped up and what does that mean on the price tag? But that being said, again, we need to not just look at loss and damages. We actually need to scale up mitigation pledges and reductions and emissions. That's the key thing, because loss and damages will just climb if we don't actually get to as close as possible to a 1.5C world, which the commitments right now are just not there.